Welcome back to the Energy Sovereignty Project and our closeout for our first week in June. Normally I record the closeout for the first week in June on the 8th, but I was out of town yesterday, and that sound you hear is the car recharging after my return. And so we'll save that for a little bit of content for next week, showing what happens with the power transfer of the car when the car arrives fully depleted and meets a set of batteries that are fully charged. That should be kind of an interesting examination. But this week, more of the same. The weather is warming up, and so as we'll see once we get back to the studio, you'll start to see that now we're starting to see that increased demand of the air conditioning on the home load. And that will obviously increase as we start to get more and more sunny days. This last week was a pretty cool examination of that, because you'll get an opportunity to see a correlation between the exterior temperature and then what the house is trying to do to compensate. So that's kind of an interesting thing to take note of. And as we start to progress towards the hotter months, July and August, what you'll also see is that the solar panels themselves don't like to be hot. And so you'll see that even though we've still got a massive amount of incoming solar energy, that the efficiency, due to them being warmed up, will actually start to decline. And that'll also be something that'll be interesting to bring to all of you as we go. But as far as this week is concerned, let's get back to the studio and we'll take a look at some of those air conditioning numbers. All right, well, welcome back to the studio. Let's get started in dissecting this first week of June. It's turned out to be a fairly interesting week because we got an opportunity to see how the changing weather, as the weather starts to get hotter, how that affects the home's consumption as we start using more air conditioning. And it's a decent amount of power, so it's get started here. So obviously we will bring up here June 1st, and starting here, you recall last month I had a friend of mine visit with his Bolt EV, and just like last time I put some power to the vehicle just to keep from sending too much power to the grid that day. I did arrive home later in the afternoon, and so by the time I did get my car plugged in, the system had already sent a little bit to the grid. You can see that 5.6 kilowatt hours there that went to the grid. Good production day, 62.7 kilowatt hours. Ending the day after putting the charge in both vehicles, we still wound up with 68% for our total solar day. And you can see some of the day's charge represented here as it's split between the two vehicles. And then also the power transfer in and out of the power wall is kind of interesting. And then here are the notes. Basically just what I said above, 7 kilowatt hours to the Tesla, 30 kilowatt hours to the Bolt, and that for him was 110 miles. So we got to be a two-car household for a brief period of time there. And then on the 2nd, not much driving, about average there. Good production, typical for June, in that mid 60s kind of range, ending the day with 82% for the total solar day. And as you can see, this starts the time of year where we start to see that yearly average of 30 kilowatt hours come into play. Where now we'll start to see on a regular basis the home will exceed 30 kilowatt hours, sometimes by a fair bit, and then that makes up for those previous months that we've had where we were in that 20 kilowatt range, sometimes even dipping into the low teens. So it's mostly due to when the weather is mild and the AC isn't working hard at all. And that time of year is fairly good average. You wind up getting, from this time of year forward, we'll be getting into the 40 kilowatt hour range fairly frequently. And that'll probably stick with us until August. And then the notes, 8 kilowatts to the vehicle, basically keeping the car charged at its 90% range. Other than that, nothing to really mention. The system's still in recovery from that heavy discharge from the previous day when we had our 2 EV household briefly. And that obviously meant that nothing was sent to the grid that day. And so then on the 3rd gives us another good day of really good production, bringing the system total to 100% with no place to really put the power. We got limited driving, so a small amount wound up going to the grid, only 1.5 kilowatt hours, but still enough to record it. I'll let you look at that for a minute. 37.9 kilowatt hours used for the house. Again, that's due to that AC creeping up on us. And the notes, again, 8 kilowatt hours to the vehicle, topping it off at 90%. Not much else to say here. The system is just kind of settling into a status quo for the summer. As you can see in the main log, we used 45.9 kilowatt hours, and then less the 8 kilowatt hours to the vehicle. We're still, in the high 30s consumption for the home. And then on the 4th, and again, you start seeing those temperatures rising. And even though the driving was minimal, we still saw home use of 50.8 kilowatt hours. Some of that was due to cooking, but overall the culprit was the AC. Still, we managed to send some power to the grid. The car was fully charged, and so it peaked. The other thing to remember is that solar starts to fall off in the evening, and as it does so, if the AC kicks on, it can start to discharge the batteries earlier than usual, because obviously the AC then outstrips what the solar is producing, and just adds to what the home would usually use, whereas the fall off would usually mean that we would be able to last until maybe 7:30 or so before the home matched the amount that the solar was producing, and then it would start to deplete slightly between 7:30 and 8 o'clock or so. Whereas here, the AC will actually sometimes kicks on in that maybe 6 or 7 o'clock time period, and immediately, boom, outstrips what the solar is producing, and so then you see a bit of a dip happen there, and that was reflected in what was shown here. We saw a system peak at 100%, but it discharged down to 83. And the notes, basically what I just said. 10 kilowatt hours to the vehicle. That for a second here, and then we have the 5th, pretty much a repeat of the previous day. Decent production, but I'm going to call this one a contribution day as far as grid power, even though we didn't send a substantial amount to the grid, only 0.7 kilowatt hours. But the reason I'm going to do this is out of fairness to the system. We really gave the system a workout. I mean, even with the substantial draw of 20 kilowatt hours to the vehicle, the system still managed to recover. And then we wound up with 53.5 kilowatt hours to the home, again, because of that AC, and 20 to the vehicle. And this shows what you can accomplish with time management, depending on when you actually have those loads come on. With the, when the loads occur during the day, have a huge difference on the system's performance day to day. you may want to pause this video here and then on the 6th come back here to compare how what the choices that we made on the 5th, how those affected the 6th. So that I found that kind of interesting. And so here's the notes. Again, 20 kilowatt hours to the vehicle, basic vehicle data, notes showing that heavy AC, temperature was around 100 degrees, and just a very limited amount sent to the grid. And so again, here's the 6th. And remember what I said previously, because on the 5th, I was able to come home in the afternoon and charge the car while solar was still producing. Now, today, on the 6th, we were able to begin with 48% because of the time management that we had the previous day, and the result of that plus the mild temperatures, we only wound up drawing 23.5 kilowatt hours to the home. And then this was just one of those days where I worked late, didn't put a charge to the car, and so then you can see the result of that. Wound up sending a bit to the grid. And here we have the 6th. Remember what we said previously, because on the 5th I was able to come home in the afternoon and charge while solar was still producing. We were able to begin the day at 48%. And the result of that, plus mild temperatures, you saw a reduction of the total home use to 23.5 kilowatt hours. And this is also one of those days where I worked late, so no charge today. Instead, the charge wound up being reflected as happening on the 7th. And then here's the notes for that. Nothing to the vehicle. Start and stop a little there. Give you a second for taking that in. And then the 7th. Another pretty average day of driving. Vehicle wound up receiving that 15 kilowatt hours early in the morning. System still peaked pretty early in the day though at 66.1 kilowatt hours of total production. But now there was little choice to make. Car was full. So what do? Well, we wound up shunting that entire day's excess production to the grid. A whopping 23.8 kilowatt hours to the grid. And that's just, again, the result of not having any place to put the power. And so we got the notes, 15 kilowatt hours to the vehicle. Again, topping that off. Not a lot to say there, other than to show that 15 kilowatts to the car and still topping it off. Charging the car to 100% just makes 0 cents, and so out to the grid it goes. And then we've got the 8th. Now here was an interesting day. Heavy weekend of driving was planned. I was planning on attending this cute parade with some friends in Fairfax, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in just a minute as far as the vehicle situation when we review the 9th. But basically you see what we have here. I charged the car when I left home. The weather was nice, fairly mild, so not a lot of AC use. Moderate home consumption today, 29.3 kilowatt hours. Most of that additionals from AC. Adding the 15 kilowatt hours, we have a total daily use of 44.3 kilowatt hours. Took enough of a hit from the system early in the morning to top the car off, so we limited the amount of power that we sent out to the grid at 6.5 kilowatt hours. And then the notes. And just like I mentioned here, heading out in the early morning, set the car to fully charge. That dropped the initial daily charge a little bit. Let's read that a second. And then here we have the 9th. Now traditionally I end this first week on the end of total solar day on the 8th, but I was out of town that day, so you get a bit of a bonus-ish for this week. I'll pick up here next week and we can discuss further, but you see here that I didn't quite make the round trip. I had to put a little bit in from the supercharger. And so let's talk a little bit about the day first, and then I'll kind of go over what happened here. So obviously we had good production, 59 kilowatt hours. We got hazy conditions, and that's due to a massive fire that we have just north of here in Yolo County. And normally our output for this time of year, well, normally the last year I have that to measure, it was about 2% higher than what we're seeing now. But not all of that can be attributed to the haze. Some of that is because it's a lot warmer this June than it was last June. And so on the 9th, for example, it is 102 degrees. And the solar panels just simply don't like that very much. They tend to drop in efficiency. And then the other thing that bears that out today was our highest total consumption day of the year. 107 kilowatt hours. I mean, the house alone consumed a whopping 58 kilowatt hours, and that was the AC. You know, obviously nothing went to the grid today. And I'll bring up the notes here real quick. We ended the total system charge at the end of total solar day at 47%, but that is still very impressive considering to the degree that we worked the system out. So all kinds of interesting stuff this week, and a good window into seeing how the system performs at higher temperatures. I mean, imagine having to pay for that AC use in midsummer. I wouldn't have wanted to see this month's power bill. It's going to be really interesting to take a look at that at the end of the year, to take a look at our total consumption. And the driving is something that I'm going to save for next week's discussion. And I want to touch on something that I've mentioned in the past regarding what kind of ranges we're going to want to see in electric vehicles. And I know that some of the comments that I've made previously regarding that, I've gotten some pushback that my assessment of how much range an electric vehicle is going to need was artificially high. And there was even a recent comment where I was kind of taken to task for my estimate of, you know, how much range an electric vehicle really needed. So not only will I talk about that in next week's recap, but I also want to do a separate video of it. It'll be interesting to see the recap for next week, because what that kind of does is it shows us a real world example of exactly why I elevated my estimate for those ranges. But this really is something that's going to require its own video, I think, so that I can go into detail about the differences between an electric vehicle and an ICE vehicle, and how we want to use some of the extra freeboard to maximize the amount of range that we're actually able to do off of power that we've created in our own systems, as well as keeping the vehicle in that 40 to 60% charge range, so that the batteries they'll last a long time if we're able to just work that area. And then occasionally, like this weekend, when we need that extra range, to then be able to fully charge it and take advantage of that extra range. But that brings us to a close for this first week in June. Kind of an interesting week. And so thanks for following along with all of this. And as always, if this is something that you've stumbled upon that you enjoy, then please feel free to like and subscribe, and feel free to submit any questions or comments that you have about our system, and I'll try to get some of those questions answered. And until next week, good luck with your own systems, and we'll see you next time.